I've been really looking forward to hearing from our next speaker, who is Greg Phillips, who is a Wanyi and Jaru, is from the Greg is from the Wanyi and Jaru peoples and comes from Cloncurry and Mount Isa. He's a medical anthropologist and has a PhD in psychology and a research master's degree in medical science. His numerous and literally life-changing achievements belie his age, as does his 20 years' work experience in healing, alcohol and other drugs, youth empowerment, medical education and health workforce. He developed an accredited Indigenous health curriculum for all medical schools in Australia and New Zealand, founded the Leaders in Indigenous Medical Education Network and wrote a National Indigenous Health Workforce Strategy. Today, Greg will explore how we can achieve a deeper understanding of Australia's Indigenous history, not just in the abstract, but in the specific context of where we live, work and play. If all Australians had a relationship with Indigenous language, how would that affect race relations more broadly? It's a big question. It's a big question to answer in 15 minutes, but if there's one man who's up to the task, it's Greg. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Yes, I'd acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation here where we are. So in answering this question, I'll interrogate place and naming as two powerful concepts or artefacts or expressions of cultural values. In other words, I will attempt to interrobang them. Why are some places in Australia now already named with Aboriginal words and others aren't? So in Queensland there's Caboolture and Indooroopilly and beautiful names like that. In Sydney you know of Woy Woy and Wagga Wagga and others, Coogee, Yakandanda here in Victoria, Joondalup in Perth, Uluru and Canberra. Now Tasmania has recently renamed Mount Wellington its correct name, Kunanyi from the Palawa languages. And I'll talk about this naming policy. They've actually got an official naming policy in Tasmania now. But why not rename Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Darwin and Perth? What is it? What's the difference between how we accept current place names that are using Aboriginal languages and not so much others? Is it about random acts of kindness or random acts of being conscious? Otherwise, it's pretty much a colonial landscape that we still live in. So let's turn to this idea of place first. And I'm going to use broad brushstrokes here to describe Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and European cultures. But to try and draw out some of the central tenets in those and what are the differences and what are the similarities between a concept like place. So in Aboriginal cultures and Torres Strait Islander cultures, place and land is the basis of our whole cosmology. It ties in together genealogy, spirituality, law, ethics, knowledge, intellectual property. All of these things are tied together for Aboriginal people in a place. So, for example, my niece's Aboriginal name is Longanjamara, and Longanjamara is from our language, and an elder near Borroloola gave her that name because it refers to not only her physical name and her place in the social structure of our tribe, but also a lake, a small billabong. So what that does is it ties us to our responsibility for a specific piece of land or a place, to look after a place, to gain our identity from a place, but to also give back to. So in Aboriginal cultures, context is everything. Everything's interconnected. Philosophically, Auntie Mary Graham from Brisbane acknowledges that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' logic and philosophy is very different to the West's. So the West's logic is something like P or not P, right? You remember all your basic sort of logic studies in psychology or in society. P or not P, or I think therefore I am. So it's a very mental and physical based understanding of the world. The epistemology and the logic and the ontology of Western cultures is very much about one or the other. P or not P, I think therefore I am, and if I don't think then I'm not alive, apparently. something like that. But for Aboriginal people, our cosmology and our logic and our philosophy is based on a statement something like, every perspective is valid and reasonable. So in Aboriginal mindsets, we don't think about something being correct or incorrect. We think about something being correct or incorrect in certain contexts. So we have this very nice way of being able to balance truth and non-truth as actually the same thing, that all perspectives are valid and reasonable in our philosophy and logic. Now, on the other hand, European cultures... to finish that point, so for Aboriginal peoples, everything is interconnected and we're in a relationship with the land. It's not just something that exists as an other entity that is separate to us as human beings. We're in a relationship with it and we understand that we're connected. And our stories and cosmology give effect to that. In the European sense of place, place is about land and considered as inanimate, as a physical location to be owned and dominated perhaps, that land is of monetary value to be dug up and consumed. Now, what I find interesting is some of the conversations that farmers have, though, that after generations of working and living with the land, they start to feel this affection for and start to talk about land in similar terms to Aboriginal communities, and talk about a deep love for the land and about their connection to it and their family history there. Don't you know we've been on this land for 6 generations, which is great, but it's kind of minuscule. But even so, in describing that relationship, it's still couched in monetary terms. So you can love the land if there is some value that comes back to the human being that is monetary. And it's very interesting to consider how people might find land in non-monetary terms. And that does happen, of course, in European cultures sometimes. But our whole basis of society in the West now is not based on that. But why is that? Why has the West moved from an understanding of an earth, or from being an earth-based culture? Why is there a change? What happened between Stonehenge and Druid culture, for example, and the understanding of land and place that we now have in the West? What happened? How did we get to industrialisation? And in short terms, it's all about power and money. That land became a commodity. It became something to own and make money from. So power and money, you know, maybe we can say money is the root of all evil, power corrupts, absolutely, etc. But when I think about power and money and why a society would move that way, what I think they're both about is fear. That's the human emotion underneath them. Fear that there will be not enough food or not enough resources. Fear that there will be not enough love or not enough connection, and so therefore an attempt to control the environment and control human emotions and control interactions. So control and fear then were the basis for science and religion to be used as justification for colonisation. Now, science and religion are in and of themselves not bad things, but it's how you use them and why you use them, for what purposes and for what means and what ends. They were used for colonisation. So philosophically, this is where the point about I think therefore I am, and incidentally, Aristotelian logic and philosophy is in some ways a bastardisation of logic and philosophy, and that came from the University of Songhai in Mali, in fact, one of the first universities in the world. One is now Mali and Ghana. And there is some evidence that Aristotle footnoted those scholars in his original writings, but then, of course, over the centuries, those footnotes got forgotten. Anyhow, I think therefore I am, and P or not P, what it does is it gives rise to adversarial law, that someone is right and someone is wrong, that someone misses out and someone wins. And this binary thinking, this adversarial logic, underpins most of Western society these days. So what we're talking about here is about values. We're talking about ontology, epistemology, what drives people and cultures to do the things that they do. That's place. That's all the meaning that's tied up in something like place. Now, if we turn to naming, intimately related to that, in Aboriginal cultures, you name something, or the names have been given by the ancestors, I guess, in a way to honour law, to honour that ongoing connection with the land, to honour ancestors, to honour a physical place as well. But it's also, as I said before with the example of my niece, about current. It's very real now. It's not ancient history versus contemporary reality. Those things are connected. There is no difference between now and the future. And so in the dreaming, what we talk about is the dreaming. I mean, the dreaming's a Western word, but it's an attempt to explain Aboriginal philosophical beliefs that the past is right here now, even if the past were fabulous, always fabulous. The past is here now, and we are now creating our dreaming here and now for others to come. And that's why we talk about planning not for the next 3-year election cycle, but for generations, because sustainability can't survive if you don't do that. Anyway, Aboriginal people have places and naming based on all of this cosmology. You get names from the skin cycle. So our genealogy is not based on hereditary in the same way that it is in the West, but it's based on a cycle of names. So in some tribes there might be 8 skin names for female and 8 for male, and basically you cycle through that. So one's child becomes the next skin name on the list, and then it goes down, and then it cycles back to the top. And that's a way of both keeping the gene pool pure, but also ensuring that there is responsibility for every piece of land, and that it's interconnected, and that there are no fights and disputes over land, actually, that it's all understood and it's all in the law already. Now, in European cultures and values, naming is about honouring people or events or place names. It's about a particular value or culture or word that might respect somebody. So, for example, Cloncurry, where I come from, is named after Lady Cloncurry. Mount Isa was named by John Campbell Miles, the man who apparently discovered Mount Isa, after a relative of his. So he shortened Isabella for Isa. Incidentally, Kabalana Mana is the Aboriginal man who actually found that mine site, or knew where it was, and he told the local postman who used to run the mail between Camwell and Dejara, and he told John Campbell Miles, but apparently John Campbell Miles discovered the mine. And really, I mean, you could say the same thing about the Blue Mountains. Did Blaxland, Lawland and Wentworth really discover it, or was it their guide ownership? But what is the commonality between Aboriginal views of place and naming and European views of place and naming? The central theme seems to be something about honouring. It seems to be about remembering and inscribing a certain set of values and logic into the land. But the point is that they're based on very different values and very logic. So Aboriginal people name things in a very different way, or have names for that European cultures might be. It's not to say one is better than the other, it's just to say they're different. I'm really interested in renaming, and how Tasmania, for example, now has a renaming policy and said, right, okay, from now on Mount Wellington is now going to be named Kunanyi. And they've got 6, they've started with 6 significant sites around Tasmania under Lara Giddings' government to rename them in their Palawa Aboriginal names. We all know about Uluru and Kakadu and the renaming that's gone on there, and that's kind of accepted, and it's part of the basic lexicon now. Perth and Adelaide have listed place names and cities, quite extensive, about 100 different place names within what is now Adelaide City Council or local government area for specific what is now parks or areas or lakes within that area. And they've gone through and done the research and find the Aboriginal names for each of those specific places. So that's great, as have Perth. But what's really interesting about this, why do we now acknowledge Uluru and Kakadu as their correct or traditional names, but why not Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth? And I think the answer is perhaps because renaming in most contexts can be about actually reinscribing white power rather than expunging it. And let me explain what I mean. to do that, I need to give a brief description of how I understand this term of whiteness. Now, whiteness, of course, is not about ethnically or physically white people. It's not about skin colour, but it is about a set of values. Whiteness is about a set of values where money and power are normalised. So neoliberalism, that money and value is, of course, how society should operate. And it's also about racism, of course, that there's superiority amongst certain races. But what I want to say is that while we all understand, I think in this room perhaps, we all understand what colonisation is and what racism is and the effects of that, whiteness is actually the values that underlie it. So whiteness are the values that gave rise to the expression of those values, that you could colonise another and you could own another, and that there could be superiority among human beings. So let me give an example of how this has played out in the Australian landscape. When the convicts in Captain Cook first arrived in 1788 or thereabouts, convicts were coming from England with a whole lot of class shaming. They were coming as, you're being rejected, you're not good enough, you don't belong here, you need to go somewhere else, you're being expelled from the tribe. And what happened when they got to Australia initially, after some of them broke out from the penal colonies, or ran away, escaped, they got looked after by some Aboriginal people. Some Aboriginal people chose to make it a fight, such as Pemulwuy in Sydney, and tried to have frontier and resistance wars. And other Aboriginal people thought, well, we should look after these people because they're being abused as well and they're running away and they need food and water. So Aboriginal people looked after them initially, and there are accounts of Aboriginal and convicts or settlers getting on very well initially. But then what happened is when they had served out their term or had gone from convict to settler, they were given land, or they were offered the opportunity to squat or to take over land and to have a plot of land by the governor at the time. So what was happening there is that the class shaming was being given a chance to be expunged, that you could make something of yourself if you took on this land. So any sort of love or nice feelings or looking after each other or relationship that convicts and Aboriginal people might have had got very changed and very quickly changed when land and value of land as money became a part of the story. So those same convicts who then became settlers, took over land, and then colonisation as we know it, so massacres and poisonings, etc., then became the order of the day. And those good feelings of relationship between human beings got changed because real estate got involved. And I think actually that's what's happening. So this opportunity to make something of yourself is an expression of whiteness. It's a value that land will fix everything. Land as money will fix everything. And I kind of think that our current obsession with, The Block and all of these shows about real estate and location, we love how expensive land is in Australia. I actually think that's an expression of whiteness and colonisation unchecked, because land has become a way to avoid the fear of not having enough and to control the environment. So we're quite happy to acknowledge traditional owners these days in Australia, which is good, but only if we get to keep our land values. So the central questions of power and money still have not been addressed. Who makes the decisions? Who owns the land? So what we do in Australia is we include Aboriginal people on white terms, on whiteness's terms, the normalised neoliberalism and racism, but we don't do social justice. We don't do equalisation of power and money. So in doing so, what we actually do is we're reinscribing white power. So yes, we should acknowledge traditional country, but if we don't as a nation have a conversation about sovereignty, and how do we share that, or how do we have a relationship now, then what we're actually doing is reinscribing white power through inclusion and equity or equality, rather than actually talking about the real issues that are remaining unchecked. So I think that this renaming business, renaming why is Sydney not renamed but Uluru is about, and incidentally, doing some quick research for this, there has been some research in Sydney. So Sydney Cove, according to some researchers, was called Cardi, and Bennelong Point, according to some, was named. Sorry, I can't actually. I've left that off. There is a name for Bennelong Point, but Meanjin is the name for Brisbane. The Brisbane area and the local Turrbal language. So why do we choose to call Uluru Uluru but not Meanjin? And I think it's because of this. We're attempting to do the right thing in Australia, and that's a great thing. We're attempting to include Aboriginal language in our discussions in some ways, but in many ways we're not, and we're doing it in a way that doesn't address the underlying power imbalance, the underlying values. It all comes back to whose values and ontology and logic is considered normal or right or valid and whose isn't. So in the absence of that deeper conversation, what we do is we do inclusion. We're going to include Aboriginal people in our constitution. Isn't that nice? It's so benevolent. We're going to include you people in ours because we like you. And that's really nice. It's very nice, but niceness is not what we're talking about. It's not actually discussing who owns the land and how do we share that. So, so if we don't have this bigger conversation, then what we're actually doing is reinscribing the fear of not enough, the logic of whiteness, and the power of the colonial. Instead, we should expunge colonisation. We should rename our cities, yes, but only after we have faced the truth of genocide, after we've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission rather than just reconciliation, after we've memorialised genocide like Germany does, after we've made reparations, after we've written this history into our national curriculum, not because we want to feel guilty forever and a day, but because we need our next generations to know what happened in their own country. And after we have a discussion about real power sharing between two sovereign groups of people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and European, how can we share sovereignty? How can we share decision making, power and money? We need to make real peace, find a peacemaking process to do this, to discuss what the country could and should be. So yes, we should rename, but we should rename as a conscious act of social justice. We should have the conversation. Our values and motivations can be pure, can be more clear, but at the moment we're not quite there. We're halfway there. We should choose atonement over guilt and shame. We should choose relationship over isolation. And of course, we should not choose fear, but we should choose love. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. That was really beautiful. We will be taking questions. Does anyone have one that we just want to head straight off the bat? If not, I'm just going to play devil's advocate here because I think you're absolutely right. I think the important thing is that a question like this starts the conversation. I remember so clearly when Uluru became, was renamed and, and just became part of the accepted conversation. Yeah. And the thing that I thought was so important is that it was a constant reminder of the traditional owners, and that itself sort of opened people's consciousness and opened a bigger conversation. What would you, from your talk, it sounded like you thought that changing names should happen after all these other things. Do you think that it could happen first and it would, create a path?
I mean, I think some of it can happen concurrently, but Uluru is a really interesting example because we now acknowledge that name and use it mostly nationally. I mean, you rarely hear it called Ayers Rock anymore. However, people are still allowed to climb up the rock. And the community of Mutijulu, right at the base of the rock, the traditional owners, still live in abject poverty. And there's multi-million-dollar tourism industry happening right on their door. So on the surface, it looks like, and there is joint management now, there's a joint management plan between Parks Australia and traditional owners. So on the surface, it looks like there is shared power and resources and decision making. But what I'm saying is we haven't interrogated the values underneath that. we haven't had that deeper conversation. So a place like Uluru absolutely should be called Uluru, and yes, that helps increase consciousness, but I'm not sure that that's the whole conversation.
Do we have any other questions from the floor?
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering what ways you think are most powerful in terms of enacting that shift.
Well, I think Australia's at a really critical point now. Basically, we have to have the conversation not just about place names, but about who belongs here. And that's actually the issue facing the whole world. There's two issues facing Australia. Identity, who owns Australia, whose is it, who gets the right to decide who lives here and who doesn't, and sustainability. How do we survive in this land, right? How do we have enough resources? How do we share? How do we look after the land? And how do we, have an economy that will work with renewables? Both of those issues intimately require Aboriginal knowledge, both about place names and who is here and who has the right for speak for which country or to look after which parts of the country, and also how should the country be managed in terms of resources. So for us to have that conversation, though, we have to do the truth and reconciliation stuff. Aboriginal people don't want to harp on about the past forever. A lot of people say, oh, we've had the apology, that's enough, get over it, let's just move forward, let's just do reconciliation and feel good about each other. But the problem with that is whiteness, white power and privilege is still normalised. That doesn't get interrogated in something like reconciliation. So reconciliation becomes about having people feel good and understand each other, but the parliament still being 98% white males or whatever, or certainly in terms of logic. So we have to have the conversation nationally about the truth of genocide and what does that mean for our society now, then redecide what values, have a national conversation about what values we want this nation to be founded on from here. I think our opportunity is the Republic, incidentally. I think we shouldn't just, on a surface level, change to a Republic. It's actually about the deeper values of what country we want to be. And we should have that conversation between Aboriginal and European people and work it out, have a new relationship. We know this history, but what do we want now? What do we want to be? Then we can start talking about what are the articles of power? What does Parliament look like? Who makes decisions on what kind of issues? Then we can start talking about how do we actually live and work together. But we're just so far from that. So we do niceness and we do inclusion. And the Adam Goodes incident, this is where we're at a really critical turning point in Australia. It really shows very clearly that for the AFL, for example, does inclusion of Aboriginal culture really well now. So, Aboriginal Week during the AF1 round is Aboriginal, and people wear Aboriginal, the players wear Aboriginal designed uniforms, and, it's widely acknowledged that Aboriginal players play the game very well and their contributions to the game. Now that's acknowledged. But when Adam Goodes, the AFL haven't interrogated their values because whiteness still informs the way, whiteness being neoliberalism, not just race, whiteness informs the way the AFL is operating so that Aboriginal culture is acceptable in Australia if it can be owned and consumed. Aboriginal designs on uniforms, the Aboriginal tourism industry is about owning and consuming Aboriginal culture on white terms. So that's acceptable. Aboriginal culture in that sense is acceptable if it's fascinating and it's the other and it's exotic and it's nice. But it's not acceptable if it's an expression of sovereignty vis-a-vis an imaginary spear. Then you will get held down for it. And what was really telling in that critical moment in the AFL's history is they'd spent 10 or 15 years or maybe more, 20 years since Nicky Winmar to try and address racism in the game, but the way they did it was through niceness and inclusion, not through social justice. So when the critical moment came for them to make a choice, they were more concerned about their ticket sales because their response was very telling. It was not The national AFL response was not, this is wrong, this is racism, that has no place in our game. Their response was, poor Adam needs time off to deal with the stress. You see, Aboriginal people are all mad, bad and sad. It keeps us in our place. And it was their chance to actually say, no, this is wrong. But what they were more worried about is their money, vis-a-vis whiteness. So the terms of power wasn't challenged. It was simply the surface issues of otherness or who owns what or who belongs where. It was inclusion, niceness, not social justice.
Well, that's all we have time for, so thank you. Oh, sorry, we've got one more. Let's do it.
What do you think of the Australian Republican movement? Like, are they worthy of support?
Yeah, look, I think we should become a republic, but I think, again, we should become a republic for the right reasons. It's not simply about... I think this... and I'm a part of the Australian Republican movement, so I think the efforts are very good, but I don't think they've done the deeper thinking about why we should be a republic. I think they're kind of on about naff stuff like, oh, it should be an Australian, head of state. And yeah, sure, but they haven't really explained to the public why we should become a republic. And the public debate is very much concerned with what we might lose rather than what we might gain. So we'll lose, Lizzie and the crown and the pomp and ceremony. And I love glamour as much as anybody else, but we're not talking about what do we gain if we become a republic. And the reason why we're not talking about that is because we don't know each other. We're scared of Aboriginal history, we're scared of addressing genocide, we're scared that it will forever make, that we would seek to forever make people guilty or ashamed of being Australian. And that's absolutely not the point. The point of addressing all of that stuff is so we can move forward. I mean, Aboriginal people want to move forward, but we're not going to move forward as a proud, confident nation if we don't know our own values. You can't know your own values if you don't address your demons. So we have to do that, and then we can become a republic for the right reasons. Being proud, all of us jointly being really proud of what we do have, things that weren't so good, but what we've got now to offer. And because we don't have that deeper conversation as a nation, we get hung up on things, on cultural cringe, on trying to be like Europe or trying to be like America, because we don't know who we are. We're still scared of Asians because, we kind of begrudgingly accept we're a part of the Asia Pacific, but only in a locality sense and only because we can make money from China, not because we might actually deeply value what Chinese culture or any other Asian culture could teach us and vice versa. So we're just incredibly insecure and small-minded in Australia in some ways. But on the other hand, we have incredible depth of talent and knowledge and wisdom here that is both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, and we're just not... we're not understanding or utilising or coming to terms with that. And when we do that, we'll be far more proudly ready, I think, to become a republic and to change place names and to really, truly understand how and why and what we could be. Sorry, I'm raving on. Last point. Uncle Joe McGuinness, a very wise elder from Darwin Way, and he and his brothers were in the union movement in the 1920s, trying to get equal rights for Aboriginal workers, started back then. He says, look, the Westminster system is a bit old, actually. It's a bit primitive. He has a kind of joke. He says it's 500 or 600 years old. If you look around the world now, the Westminster system is in some ways broken because it's become now just beholden to the oligarchy. And you have 50-50 and there's this kind of war about who's right and who's wrong, you see, logic. And he's saying it's time to refresh that. And he's also saying it's time to refresh American democracy because American democracy is actually just capitalism unfettered. It's not actually democracy anymore. And Australia's going both of those ways. But we could actually recreate something quite amazing here if we were willing and courageous enough to have that conversation.
That was such a hopeful note to finish on. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please join me in thanking you.